helping people cope with and overcome life's challenges. This is Life Transformations with Michael Hart, Canadian certified counselor and award-winning psychotherapist.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Life Transformation Show. Today's show is titled King David's Affliction. We learn a lot about King David's affliction from the Psalms. There is no ancient writing that gives us a better picture of the emotional state of someone in antiquity than King David's writings about his emotions in the Psalms. King David goes into details to express his troubling emotions in ways that are not found in any other biblical character. Much of King David's writings are similar to what you would find today in the journal of someone who is struggling with unsettling emotions and is told by their therapist to keep a record of their thoughts and how they feel. This can be seen from passages such as Psalm 38, verse 4 to 8, which reads as follows. My guilt has overwhelmed me like a burden too heavy to bear. My wounds fester and are loathsome because of my sinful folly. I am bowed down and brought very low. All day long I go about mourning. My back is filled with searing pain. There is no health in my body. I am feeble and utterly crushed. I groan in anguish of heart. And this is not just in Psalm 38, but it is found throughout the Psalm in David's writing. Psalm 55 verse 3 to 5 is another example of how David goes very deep into his emotions. Let's read Psalm 55 verse 3 to 5. It reads as follows. My thoughts trouble me, and I am distraught because of what my enemy is saying, because of the threats of the wicked, for they bring down suffering on me and assail me in their anger. My heart is in anguish within me. The terrors of death are falling on me. Fear and trembling have beset me. Horror has overwhelmed me. King David's repeated description of his troubled mental state and his physical symptoms have led many psychologists to the conclusion that he suffered from some mental or physical illness. In this podcast, I will be looking at possible mental and physical illnesses which were suggested by Professor Ben Noun of the University of Negev in Israel. In doing so, what I hope to accomplish today is to increase the awareness about symptoms that could indicate that you are suffering from a particular type of physical or mental illness. Another aim of this show is to decrease the stigma around mental illness by showing that great biblical characters suffered from mental illnesses and that there is no shame in being mentally ill. Before you turn off your radio or switch from the channel that you're listening to this show on, let me say that this is not an attack on anyone's religious belief. I am a person of faith as well. I am a believer and I've been a believer for many, many years. And I am not saying that his mental illness discredits King David's writings in any way. The Psalms are profound. I love the Psalm, and I can identify with many of the things that David talks about in the Psalms, and many of my clients identify with the Psalm and love to read the Psalms of David because it gives them a sense that someone understands and have been through what they are going through. So this is not to discredit the writings of King David or to discredit anyone's religion. As a matter of fact, many well-known and prominent politicians have struggled with mental illnesses. We know as a fact that President Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States, struggled with major depression. His colleague Joshua Wolf Schenck said that although Lincoln maintained a positive attitude in public, that he suffered from depression, and that those who were close to him knew that he suffered with depression. On one occasion, we are told that he became so depressed after the death of a close friend that he became suicidal. So to have a mental illness doesn't discredit you in any way. It is something that can happen to one of us. So one of the illnesses, my first point today is that the first illness that Professor Ben Noun suggested that King David may have suffered from. And the first one I would like to cover, at least not the first one he said, but the first one of the things he covered was generalized anxiety disorder. He said that based on the writings in the Psalms, King David may have suffered from generalized anxiety disorder. So what are the symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder? Things such as fatigue, trouble sleeping, muscle tension, muscle aches, trembling, feeling twitchy, nervousness or being easily startled, sweating, nauseousness, diarrhea. All of these are symptoms, and irritability are symptoms of generalized anxiety disorder. So let's look at some of the things that David said in his writings that made Professor Ben Noun come to this conclusion. We're told in Psalm 13 verse 3 that David, and I'll read a short quote of that verse. David said that he had agony in his heart daily. He had agony in his heart daily. So that would mean that he's experiencing some sort of trouble. And he also talks about his soul being alarmed. So that could be startled, easily startled, that we talked about as a symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. My soul is easily alarmed. And this is Psalm 6 verse 4. In Psalm 25 verse 17, David says, "The troubles of my heart are widened. Bring thou me out of my distress." So he's in distress. And we see that people with generalized anxiety have this sort of feeling of distress that they carry with them all the time. So we talk also about sleeplessness as being a symptom of generalized anxiety disorder. And we see this also in Psalm 6 verse 7, where David said, "All the night make I my bed to swim. I water my couch with my tears." So David is so troubled at night that he's saying, "I can't sleep, and all night long I'm in so much tears that my bed is wet with my tears." But we also see other signs where David talks about his lack of strength. So in Psalm 31 verse 11, we read, "My strength failed because of mine iniquity." So this could be as a result of him suffering from generalized anxiety disorder. We talked about fatigue being a symptom. So what David is saying in that verse is that he's fatigued. That's another way to look at it. My strength failed because of mine iniquity. So David is saying several things in those passages that would make psychologists and doctors believe that he is suffering from generalized anxiety disorder. And so we have other indication of that in other parts of the psalm as well, but we don't have time to go into all of those references today. But those are some of the general findings that Professor Ben Noun point to say that David, one of the things that David could have is generalized anxiety disorder. So we are going to look at several suggestions that were put forward, and then we are going to say which of the suggestions that were put forward was the best suggestion that is most likely what David suffered from. So we have covered the first one. So the first one is generalized anxiety disorder. The other conclusions that they came to, that the professor came to, and other professors or other researchers have come to in studying the writings of David, is that David may have been suffering from some physical illness. So the symptoms might not have been caused primarily by a mental illness, but it could be that there is some underlying physical illness that he's suffering from that is leading to the mood changes and the other symptoms that he talks about in the Psalm. So one suggestion is that he could have had Parkinson's disease. And we know that people with Parkinson's disease suffer from mood changes as well. And though not everyone with Parkinson's suffer from mood changes, it is very common that people with Parkinson's suffer from mood changes. Some of the clients that I have who have Parkinson's disease, they develop anxiety and they become depressed as a result of Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease was put forward as one thing that King David could have suffered from. So there are other suggestions, other physical ailments that King David might have suffered from include other things such as that he could have had an autoimmune disease. And a disease such as lupus, for example, could have created mood changes as well. He could also be suffering from hypothyroidism, and as a result of this, he could have developed those anxiety and those other symptoms that is mentioned in the writings that we have looked at so far. However, they came to the conclusion that there was not enough evidence in the Psalm to suggest that any one of these things were conclusively what he suffered from. So there are other things that they came up with. So another disorder, mental disorder that they said that King David could have suffered from is what was previously called dysthymic disorder. It has now been revised and called by the name persistent depressive disorder. And what this disorder, with symptoms, I should say, of this disorder is someone who has poor appetite or overeating, insomnia or hypersomnia, low energy or fatigue, low self-esteem is another symptom of dysthymia. And people with this kind of condition also have poor concentration or difficulty making decisions or feelings of hopelessness. So when we hear some of the things that David talked about in the Psalm, we can see how it is possible that he could have been suffering from this condition. So what are the causes of dysthymia? It could be some chemical condition in the brain. It could also be as a result of some inherited traits that he inherited that could make him suffer from this condition. But it could also be, interestingly, life events. So as with major depression, traumatic events could have been behind King David developing dysthymia. So for dysthymia, a person with dysthymia, they would have to be in a depressed or disturbed state for a period of about 2 years without relief from the symptom for no more than 2 months at a time. So dysthymia is a prolonged kind of depression that may not be as severe as a major depressive episode, but it's just there. It's this like a nagging cold that won't go away. And so it is believed that dysthymia could have been a condition that David suffered from. But this was also ruled out by Ben Noun, because he's saying that the symptoms that David had showed that he was much more severely depressed than people who have dysthymia or persistent depressive disorder. So he's saying that it's likely to be something else. But we talk about dysthymia, that the one cause of it could have been trauma in a person's life. So what kind of trauma did King David suffer in his life that could have caused dysthymia, this nagging low-level depression that just stayed with him day in, day out? We know for one thing that he lost a son. We are told that in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 17, and that David was praying for 7 days for God to spare this son's life, but that the child actually died in infancy. We know also that King David had an employer who wanted to kill him. Can you imagine that, having a boss that every day that you go to work, your boss is trying to kill you? I hope that no one who is listening to my voice has that kind of experience. If so, my advice would be that you quit that job. But we know that King David, he was employed by King Saul. He wasn't king at the time, but when he was a young man, he worked for King Saul. He would play music on the harp for King Saul. And King Saul became jealous of David, and on several occasions he tried to kill David. So talk about trauma. That would be something that would be very traumatic. But later on in life, David had many tragedies in his adult life. His son Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. So Amnon raped his half-sister Tamar. And as a result of that rape, we know that David's other son, Absalom, ended up killing Amnon over the rape. So there was a lot of family trouble in David's life, and it could be that these trauma were never resolved, and as a result of it, David had dysthymia, and so he suffered from this low-grade depression for quite a long time, as found in his writings. But they ruled that out, as I said before. And so this takes me to the diagnosis that Professor Ben Noun said was most probable, the one that is probably what David suffered from. And this is what is called major depression. So it's believed that David suffered most likely from major depression.
Michael will be right back. You have been listening to the Life Transformation Show, where award-winning psychotherapist Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services has been speaking on the topic, The Affliction of King David. You can find out more about us at elimcounselingministry.com or by calling 1-877-544-3546, where you can also make a donation to this Christ-centered ministry. Back to Michael.
So what is major depression? Let's talk a little bit about major depression. So major depression, as the name suggests, is a severe depressed mood. People with major depression have this severely depressed mood. And that's why Professor Ben Noun says it wasn't dysthymia, because major depression is most severe. And this is one of the 9 criterias that is specified in the Manual for Mental Illness as being one of the symptoms of someone with major depression. And so we find evidence for this in Psalm 51 verse 19, where David talks about being broken and having a broken and depressed heart. And in verses where he said, I am feeble and depressed. I have groaned by reason of the suffering of my heart. So we find this in Psalm 38 verse 9. So this indicates that he was severely depressed, and this is one of the criteria that is required to be diagnosed with a major depressive episode. So let's see if we can get 5, because 5 is needed to be diagnosed with a major depression. So we have 1 so far, a severely depressed mood. Another criteria that is required to be diagnosed with a major depression is to have appetite change or weight change. And so we are told in Psalm 109 verse 24, 109 verse 24, for example, that David says, my knees are weak through fasting, and my flesh failed of fatness. So when David said his knees are weak through fasting, he's not talking about a spiritual fast. He's talking about, I have no appetite. I am not eating. And as a result, my flesh is failing. In other words, I am losing weight. And so this is another criteria that could mean that he's suffering from major depression. Another criteria that is needed for a diagnosis of major depression is sleep trouble such as insomnia or hypersomnia. So we see evidence of this in Psalm 6 verse 7, where David writes, all the night I make my bed to swim, I water my couch with my tears. So David is up all night. He can't sleep. He's crying. And so this is why scholars believe that David was suffering from major depression. So this weeping and the crying is one of the other criteria. So we have 3 criteria so far, and we need 5 for a diagnosis of a major depression. So let's see if we can get some more. Then another criteria is what is called psychomotor agitation or retardation. And what this means is that a person is either shaking all the time, they can't keep still, or they have retardation in which they are fixed in a particular state and they're motionless. So let's see if we can find evidence of either. So Psalm 55 verse 6 reads as follows, fearfulness and trembling are come upon me. That seems like psychomotor agitation. He's agitated. He's trembling. And so this shaking makes psychologists believe that this is another symptom of major depression. But that's not the only place where that is found in the writings of David. We see this in verse 5 of the same psalm, where he says, my heart is shivering within me. And we find this in other places, such as Psalm 38 and verse 14, where he said, like a deaf man I would not hear, and like a mute I would not speak. So that's retardation, that's psychomotor retardation, where he is fixed in a certain state. Like a deaf man, he would not hear, and like a mute man, he would not speak. So this is another criteria. So we have 4 so far. But we see in other places, other things as well. We see David talking about fatigue or loss of energy, which is another criteria to be diagnosed with major depression. So a verse that indicates that is Psalm 31 verse 11. David says, my strength failed because of mine iniquity. So we have 5 so far, and the list continues. We find another of the criteria being feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt. And we see that in Psalm 22 verse 17, where David said, I am a worm and a no man, a disgrace of men and despised of the people. So think about this. This is King David. Many of us would give anything to have the achievements of King David, but in his depressed state, in the state of major depression, he's saying, I am a worm, I am a no man, a disgrace of men, and despise of the people. But in other places too, such as Psalm 31 verse 13, he says, I am forgotten as a dead man, out of mind. I am like a lost tool. So that seems like someone who is really depressed. When you start calling yourself a lost tool, then you know you're not feeling very positive about yourself. And so we have that criteria there as well. But then another criteria is current unfocused thoughts of death or suicide attempt. So is this in David's writing? Let's see. So if we look at Psalm 22 and verse 16, David says that God has brought me into the dust of the earth, to death. And then he talks about the terrible fears of death had fallen upon him in Psalm 55 verse 5. The terrible fears of death had fallen upon me. And in Psalm 18, verse 5, he says, the sorrows of death compassed me. In Psalm 18 verse 6, he also says that the minds of death preceded me. The minds, or the mind feel of death. It's almost as if death is all around him. So he has this recurrent, unfocused thought of death. And so this is another criteria. So David met many of the criteria for major depression. And so this is the one that they says is what David most likely suffered from. So if you have listened to this show today, this is not just an exercise of looking at scriptures, but it's also a way of helping you to see whether or not you can identify with any of what David suffered from. If you can identify with any of those, it is possible that you are suffering from a major depression or dysthymia, or maybe you have one of those physical conditions that we talk about. If that's the case, then we suggest that you reach out for help, because many illnesses and many mental illnesses can be cured if you get help early. So reach out for help. We want to remind you that we are a counseling organization that provide professional counseling from a Christian perspective. You can find out more about us by going to our website at elimcounselingministry.com. elimcounselingministry.com. Elim is spelled E-L-I-M, counseling with 2 L's, ministry.com. You can also give us a call at 1-877-544-3546. We are a non-profit organization, so we ask for your support in keeping this ministry going and in providing counseling to those who are in need. We also have over 200 podcasts on our YouTube channel that you can find resources that can help you in whatever it is that you are going through. So I want to thank you again for being with us on this episode of the Life Transformation Show. It was so good to be here today, and I look forward for you joining me next time. So until next time, this is your host Michael Hart of Elim Counseling Services, praying that God would bless you in all your relationships and to keep you sound in mind and pure in heart.